April 12, 1945. Germany was collapsing and its armies were retreating on every front. Orders still traveled through the chain of command, demanding obedience even as the Reich crumbled. In a small village outside Dresden, Hauptmann Klaus Becker, a decorated Wehrmacht officer who had spent 6 years fighting without question, received one final command that would redefine his life. He was not a rebel or a secret humanitarian. He was a career soldier shaped by duty and survival. However, when he encountered a 7-year-old girl holding a cracked porcelain doll, he faced a choice that would cost him everything and save far more than he expected. Hauptmann Klaus Becker stood inside a farmhouse that had been turned into a makeshift command post. The air smelled of old hay mixed with diesel fumes. At 34, he carried the exhaustion of 6 relentless years of war. Stalingrad, endless retreats, and the medals he earned simply because he survived had aged him far beyond his years. His face carried the deep lines of the Eastern Front, and he felt every one of them. At the wooden table, SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Vogel unfolded a map. His uniform was spotless, as if untouched by the collapsing state around them. He pointed to a small dot labeled Kleinfeld and stated the mission with calm precision. Becker's company was to secure the village and eliminate reported partisan activity. The phrasing left no room for misunderstanding. Becker asked about the civilian population, and Vogel dismissed the question. He stated that liquidation protocols applied. The words brought a cold heaviness into the room. Becker had heard them before in the East, where entire villages vanished under similar orders. His executive officer, Lieutenant Franz Richter, shifted uncomfortably. He had children at home and understood the gravity of what had just been assigned. Becker saluted and kept his expression neutral, although something twisted inside him. The war was lost, the SS punished hesitation without mercy, and Becker's own wife and daughter depended on the protection his rank still provided. Disobedience meant death. Obedience meant an unthinkable act. At dawn, 43 worn-out soldiers assembled. Most were barely older than boys. They had retreated for months, and their faces carried the fatigue of constant fear. Otto Schmidt, only 19, tried to steady his rifle. Kurt Waldmann smoked in silence to hide his nerves. Heinrich Braun, the oldest, marched only so he might someday return to his farm. The march through the forest took 3 hours. Spring sunlight filtered through the trees, although the air felt strangely hollow. Becker kept replaying Vogel's order. The SS would check everything. If he refused, Vogel would return by evening with chains or a bullet. His family would lose every privilege that protected them from starvation. When they reached the edge of the forest, Becker scanned Kleinfeld with binoculars. It sat quietly in a shallow valley with a church and a cluster of small homes. Smoke rose from several chimneys. What he saw in the square made his stomach tighten. These people were not partisans. They were refugees. Elderly men rested on benches. Mothers held infants. Children played near a well, too tired to run. There were no weapons, no radios, and no signs of hidden fighters. Only 63 people who had fled the destruction of Dresden. Franz stepped beside him and spoke quietly. "Sir, these are civilians." Becker lowered the binoculars and said nothing. Vogel would return in 6 hours. Everything would be documented and photographed. Refusing meant immediate execution. There would be no way to hide what he chose. The soldiers entered the village slowly, although the people were too broken to resist. An elderly priest pleaded for mercy and explained that they had escaped the bombing of Dresden. Becker counted the children. 18 were under 12. Every face showed fear and exhaustion. Then he saw the girl. She was 7 years old with pale braids tied by faded blue ribbons. She held a porcelain doll that was missing an arm. Her eyes were calm in a way that only children who had witnessed too much death could understand. She held the broken doll as if it was the last piece of her world. Something inside Becker cracked. He had obeyed every command for 6 years and convinced himself that conscience had no place in war. However, standing in that square and looking at that child, he realized that following this order would destroy what little remained of him. He turned to Franz and told him to assemble the men away from the civilians. His voice was firm, although his heart raced. He understood that he had just crossed a line that could never be reversed. This decision would soon place him in direct conflict with the SS and force 4 soldiers to choose between survival and humanity. It would also begin a desperate struggle that would end in violence only a few meters from safety. Becker gathered his men behind the church where the civilians could not see them. 43 worn faces watched him, each of them dreading the orders they expected to hear. These were not fanatics who believed in final victories. They were ordinary Germans in uniform, men who had once been farmers, clerks, and teachers, and now only wanted the war to end. Otto's hands trembled as he held his rifle. Heinrich smoked down to the filter. Kurt stared at the ground to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. Becker spoke quietly. He told them the orders were liquidation and that Vogel would return at 1500 hours to verify the operation with photographs and body counts. The men visibly tensed. Becker continued and stated that he would not comply. He told them anyone who wished to report him to the SS could do so and that they might even be rewarded. He refused to kill refugees. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Franz spoke with a shaking voice. He said he had children who were almost the same age as the girl in the square, that he could never face them again if he participated. Heinrich admitted that he had lost faith in the cause long ago and that he would not kill innocent people for officers who would soon disappear into some distant country. Kurt added that he had once taught children to read and would not raise a weapon against them now. Otto looked frightened and asked what they were supposed to do. Becker had been thinking about that since the march to Kleinfeld. He described a plan to falsify the report by creating the appearance of a partisan attack. They would claim that the civilians had been taken hostage and had escaped during the fighting. They would hide the refugees and later guide them toward American lines. Franz warned him that Vogel would investigate, since the SS rarely accepted vague accounts. Becker knew this. However, he also knew that the collapsing state was drowning in its own chaos. If they staged the scene convincingly enough, Vogel would not risk wasting time on one village. He laid out the plan. They would burn 2 structures, fire weapons, scatter belongings, and leave signs of a brief but violent engagement. When Vogel arrived, they would appear to be pursuing the fleeing partisans. It was dangerous, unreliable, and full of risks, yet it was better than murdering 63 innocent people. 27 men volunteered without hesitation. The rest remained silent, which Becker accepted as agreement. He assigned tasks. Franz would lead the civilians to an abandoned farm 3 kilometers north. Kurt would manage the false battle site. Heinrich would gather supplies for the journey to American lines. Otto would act as courier between the groups. Becker then approached the civilians. The grandmother of the little girl stepped forward and introduced herself as Anna Weber. Her granddaughter, also named Anna, gazed up at him, holding tightly to the broken doll. She asked if the soldiers were going to shoot them. Becker felt the question cut straight through him. He knelt and told her no. He explained that they were going to hide her and that she had to follow his men closely. She nodded with quiet seriousness. Franz quickly organized the refugees into groups. They would travel through the forest to the abandoned farm, remain hidden during daylight, and continue at night toward American lines. The journey was dangerous, since the area was filled with SS patrols, lost soldiers, and desperate deserters. The odds of success were terribly low, although they were still better than staying in Kleinfeld. Meanwhile, Kurt's team staged the deception. The barns were burned, shots were fired into the air, bullet holes were created in walls, and personal items were scattered to suggest panic. A pig was killed to provide blood, which was dragged across the ground to imply casualties. By 1100 hours, the civilians were hidden. Becker waited for Vogel, who arrived exactly on time with staff cars and a photographer. Becker delivered the false report. Vogel inspected the scene carefully, although his expression revealed nothing. He finally stated that the official paperwork would claim that partisans were eliminated and collaborators processed. He told Becker that Berlin only cared about documents that looked correct. Both men understood that he was choosing convenience over truth. When Vogel left, Franz whispered that the SS officer had seen through the lies. Becker agreed and said they had at most 2 days before someone returned. They needed to move immediately. Little Anna approached him before they departed and thanked him for not killing them. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than Vogel's threats. Becker told her to stay close to the group and someday repair her doll properly. As night gathered over Kleinfeld, Becker assembled his volunteers and prepared for the long and dangerous journey that lay ahead. Their choices in the coming hours would test every belief they still held about honor and humanity in a world that had nearly lost both. They left the ruins of Kleinfeld at 2200 hours, 63 civilians moving in a fragile column guarded by 27 soldiers who had transformed themselves into outlaws within a single hour. The spring night was cold enough to whiten breath, and every step across the forest floor carried the threat of discovery. Becker divided them into 3 sections to keep order. Franz guided the vanguard with the youngest children and the elderly. Kurt managed the stronger adults in the middle, and Heinrich guarded the rear with 5 soldiers who watched the darkness as though it were alive. Little Anna walked beside Otto, who had quietly adopted her. He carried her when she weakened, shared his rations with her grandmother, and told her stories about his Bavarian home to soften the roar of distant artillery. Her smile, faint and brief, felt like an act of defiance against the war that had stolen everything else. Progress was painfully slow. The elderly stumbled often, small children slept against the shoulders of strangers, and every snapped branch sent shivers of fear through the group. Becker steered them through thick forest where no road patrol could easily follow. By dawn, they reached a ruined farm where the barn still offered enough shelter to hide them. Sentries were posted, and everyone else collapsed into the moldy hay. During the night, Anna's grandmother had weakened. Kurt recognized the fever immediately and knew what it meant. Antibiotics could have saved her, although such supplies were impossible to find. At the same time, Franz delivered grim news. 2 soldiers had deserted with their weapons. They knew everything, which meant the SS would be informed as soon as the deserters bargained for their own survival. Becker understood how little time remained. They set out again at dusk, despite exhaustion. Anna's grandmother could no longer walk, so the remaining soldiers built a stretcher from branches and an old coat. It slowed their progress and reduced their combat strength. Becker accepted this without hesitation. The girl stayed near him, clutching her doll as though it carried the last warmth left in the world. The second night punished them. Heavy rain turned the forest floor into sucking mud. Children cried from cold until their mothers soothed them with desperate hands. Around 0200 hours, Heinrich reported vehicle lights on a parallel road. An SS patrol advanced slowly through the storm, and Becker signaled for absolute stillness. 71 people held their breath as lights swept the trees. For several terrifying minutes, the patrol searched the forest line. The soldiers carried out their search methodically, stepping closer until Becker believed he would have to sacrifice his men for the civilians to scatter. Then an order rang out, and the patrol withdrew. Franz knew what that meant. The deserters had talked, and the hunt had begun. They pushed through the night, covering 8 kilometers before Anna's grandmother succumbed to her illness near dawn. The burial was quick and wordless, marked only by stones. The girl collapsed into Otto's arms, and Becker knew the grief would follow her for the rest of her life. They marched through a clear morning that increased their danger. German reconnaissance still operated sporadically, and SS units were undoubtedly searching. By afternoon, Franz returned with a report. American positions lay 5 kilometers northwest, but an SS checkpoint controlled the only bridge across the creek. The water ran too deep and fast for civilians to cross safely. Becker understood that they had no choice except to seize the bridge under cover of darkness and drive the civilians across before the SS could mount a defense night arrived with the weight of inevitability. Ammunition was low, and 2 more soldiers had deserted during the day. The remaining 25 prepared themselves with quiet determination. They had ceased to think of themselves as Wehrmacht soldiers and had become instead the fragile line between life and death for the people behind them. The assault began at 21:45 hours. Gunfire crashed through the night, and muzzle flashes lit the checkpoint like sudden lightning. The SS were caught off guard and struggled to respond. The civilians ran across the bridge in a desperate stream, protected by rifle volleys and Otto's unwavering shield around Anna. American soldiers saw the flood of refugees and lowered their weapons. Guiding them behind defensive lines, Becker shouted for withdrawal, and his men began to fall back, although the SS had finally organized their defense. Heavy fire tore into the trees. As Becker's group neared the bridge, military police emerged behind them, blocking their escape. The MP commander recognized treason when he saw it. The shooting ceased, and Becker heard Anna calling to him from the far side of the bridge as the MPs placed him under arrest. The court-martial convened 3 days later in an abandoned schoolhouse. The charges were read without drama. The verdict was determined long before Becker entered the room: death by firing squad at dawn. Becker spoke simply, saying that he had followed orders for 6 years and had refused to murder children for the sake of obedience. The others gave similar testimony, each acknowledging that conscience had carried its own commands. They were held in a basement that night. Around 200 hours, the possibility of escape arose. Some believed it hopeless, although Becker understood that survival was no longer the only objective witnesses were needed. Young Anna would need to know the truth one day. At 300 hours, they attempted the escape and ran into the darkness. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. Kurt fell first. Heinrich collapsed beside a ditch. Franz went down before reaching the trees. Otto and 2 others reached the forest. Becker was nearly there when the bullets found him. He collapsed beneath the cold April sky, aware that his life was slipping. An officer knelt beside him, confirming that 2 of his men had reached the Americans. Becker found peace in that knowledge. He tried to speak Anna's name, although his voice failed as the world dimmed. Klaus Becker died not far from freedom, although he had already secured it for others. His final act became a memory carried by those who reached safety, a truth that survived long after uniforms and orders turned to dust. May 8, 1945 arrived with parades and liberation speeches, yet the displaced persons camps told a far quieter version of victory. In an American camp near Frankfurt, 7-year-old Anna Hoffmann sat on a worn cot holding her cracked porcelain doll, the last remnant of her former life. She asked every interpreter and officer the same question. She wanted to know what had happened to the tall soldier with the sad eyes who had carried her through mud, shielded her from gunfire, and promised that she would be safe. The chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, tried to reassure her, but Anna insisted on his name. "Captain Becker," she whispered. "He said he would come." 2 German soldiers had survived long enough to reach the American lines after Becker's final stand. Otto Schmidt and Joseph Klein were interrogated by U.S. intelligence, their accounts written into thick wartime files, already overflowing with testimonies about massacres and scorched villages. Otto told the Americans everything. He described Kleinfeld, the liquidation order, the desperate 3-day escape, and the 71 refugees Becker had forced into motion. When the American officer asked why they had risked execution, Otto replied that soldiers were meant to draw a line between duty and murder, and that their captain had shown them where that line stood. Becker's name was eventually logged among those executed for treason. A small note explained that the treason involved refusing to participate in civilian liquidation and assisting an escape. Another bureaucrat stamped the case potential humanitarian recognition, filed it under a stack of similar complexities, and moved on. Anna's questions remained unanswered because no one in the camp knew the man she described or understood the story she carried alone. The silence followed her into adulthood. Germany rebuilt itself while bearing what did not fit the accepted narratives of guilt, innocence, and accountability. Anna grew into a woman who learned to speak sparingly about the past, yet she kept one memory untouched. She remembered the moment a weary officer had lifted her from death's reach and given her a chance to live. She also believed no one would accept that such compassion had come from a man wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht. By 1965, Klaus Becker existed only as a footnote in an East German archive, labeled an executed traitor. His act of defiance was reduced to a crime, and his family died without ever learning the truth. His grave remained unmarked in a section reserved for those considered unworthy of remembrance. Everything changed in 1988 when Anna, now a school archivist, gained access to newly declassified wartime files. She found a faded report detailing an officer who had refused an order and was executed. The date matched her escape. The location matched the river crossing. The fragment of truth she had held privately for 43 years finally aligned with the historical record. Her search led her to a military cemetery near Dresden, where she found Becker's unmarked plot. A documentary filmmaker interviewed her soon after, then located 3 surviving veterans from Becker's unit. Their testimonies reopened wounds they had learned to bury. They spoke about Becker's refusal not as a single act, but as the moment that allowed them to reclaim their own humanity in a collapsing world. So, what are your thoughts on this incredible story? Would you want to experience moments like these yourself? Let me know in the comments, and remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.